Jungkook thought their goodbye was only part of the script, until Jimin walked away and Jungkook broke down for a reason no one expected. "Don't let him leave, Jungkook." The director's voice cracked through the studio just as Jimin turned his back, and Jungkook realized with terrifying clarity that he could no longer remember where the acting ended and his real feelings began. Rain hammered against the enormous warehouse windows, turning the glass into trembling sheets of silver. The artificial streetlights outside flickered through the darkness, casting pale reflections across the wet floor where Jimin stood alone beneath a single spotlight. His costume was soaked from the scene they had just filmed, dark strands of hair clinging to his forehead, his chest rising and falling as though he had genuinely been running from something far more dangerous than a camera. "Cut," the director shouted. "Perfect, absolutely perfect. Jimin, stay there. Jungkook, give me the breakdown again, but this time I want more pain." Jungkook heard the words, but they seemed to come from somewhere underwater. His hands were shaking. His throat felt painfully dry. The scene was supposed to be simple. Jimin was leaving. Jungkook was supposed to stop him. They had rehearsed it 11 times that afternoon. They had discussed every movement, every glance, every pause. Jimin would walk toward the warehouse doors. Jungkook would chase him. Jungkook would grab his wrist. Jimin would pull away. Jungkook would whisper his final line, then the camera would cut to Jimin's face and the scene would end. It was acting, nothing more, at least that was what everyone believed. "Jimin," the director called, "go back to your mark." Jimin nodded quietly. He walked back through the artificial rain, his shoes splashing against the shallow water covering the floor. When he passed Jungkook, their shoulders almost touched. "You okay?" Jimin whispered. Jungkook looked at him. For one strange second, the entire studio disappeared. There was only Jimin's face, the tiny drop of water sliding from his jaw, and the familiar crease between his eyebrows that appeared whenever he was worried. Jungkook swallowed. "Yeah," Jimin studied him for another moment. "You don't look okay." "I said I'm fine." The answer came sharper than Jungkook intended. Jimin's expression changed, not dramatically, just enough for Jungkook to notice. Jimin stepped away without another word. The cameras rolled again. "Action!" Jimin turned and began walking. Jungkook stared at his back. 1 step, 2 steps, 3. The warehouse seemed suddenly enormous. Every sound became painfully clear, the rain machines hissing above them, the electric buzz of the lights, the distant hum of the ventilation system. Jimin reached the doors, his hand closed around the handle. Jungkook was supposed to wait. He was supposed to count to 3. He was supposed to remember that this was fiction. 1, 2. Jimin pulled the door open. "Jimin," Jungkook shouted. The name escaped him with so much desperation that several crew members instinctively looked up. Jimin froze. Jungkook ran toward him. His shoes struck the wet floor again and again until he reached Jimin and grabbed his wrist exactly as rehearsed. Except this time his fingers tightened too hard. Jimin turned around, their eyes met. "Let me go," Jimin whispered, delivering the line perfectly. Jungkook was supposed to answer, "I can't." But the words would not come, his lips parted. Nothing, Jimin's eyes softened. For a moment, neither of them moved. "Jungkook," Jimin whispered so quietly that only he could hear, "say the line." Jungkook stared at him. His heart was pounding so violently that it hurt. His voice broke. The director leaned closer to the monitor. "Keep going." Jungkook tried again. "I can't let you go." The sentence sounded different this time, too real. Jimin's expression shifted. Something flickered behind his eyes. Fear, confusion, maybe recognition. "Why?" Jimin asked, still following the script. Jungkook should have answered with the next line. Instead, he whispered, "Because I don't know what I'm supposed to do when you're gone." Silence swallowed the studio. Jimin stopped breathing for half a second. The director did not call cut. Perhaps he thought the improvisation was brilliant. Perhaps everyone believed Jungkook was simply becoming completely absorbed in his character. But Jungkook knew the truth. He wasn't acting anymore. "Jungkook," Jimin whispered. "Look at me." Jungkook did. "You know this is just a scene." Jimin's voice was gentle. "I know," Jungkook replied, but his eyes were already filling with tears. Jimin's fingers slowly curled around Jungkook's wrist. "Then why are you crying?" Jungkook looked away. He could not answer. The first tear slipped down his cheek, then another. Jimin's face changed completely. "Cut," the director finally shouted. The lights brightened. The rain machines stopped. Crew members began moving around them, but Jungkook remained frozen. Jimin released his wrist slowly. "Jungkook, don't." Jungkook wiped his face quickly. "I'm sorry, you don't have to apologize. I ruined the scene." "No," Jimin stepped closer. "You didn't." Jungkook shook his head. "It was supposed to be acting." Jimin said nothing. Jungkook looked toward the warehouse doors, but when you walked away, his voice became almost inaudible. "Something inside me just..." He stopped. Jimin waited. "Just what?" Jungkook forced a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Nothing." He turned away, but Jimin knew Jungkook too well. He knew Jungkook tapped his thumb against his index finger whenever he was anxious. He knew Jungkook laughed too loudly whenever he wanted to hide sadness. He knew Jungkook avoided eye contact whenever he was lying, and right now Jungkook was doing all three. Jungkook, Jimin said, you've been different all week. Jungkook stopped. Have I? Yes, maybe I'm tired. You always say that when you don't want to talk. Jungkook closed his eyes, the words struck harder than they should have. Maybe there isn't anything to talk about. Jimin stared at him. Then why did you cry when I left? Jungkook turned around, his eyes were red, his voice was barely a whisper. Because for 1 second I forgot you were coming back. Jimin's breath caught, neither of them spoke. Behind them the crew continued preparing the next scene, unaware that something much more fragile than a scripted performance had just broken open between them. Jimin took 1 step closer. Jungkook, please don't ask me tonight. Why? Because I don't know what I'll say. Jimin studied his face, there was something wounded there, something Jungkook had hidden for far too long. Then I won't ask, Jimin said softly, but I'm not leaving. Jungkook looked at him. You promise? Jimin nodded, I promise. For the first time that night Jungkook almost smiled. Then the studio lights suddenly went out, darkness swallowed everything. A sharp metallic crash echoed from the far end of the warehouse, someone screamed. Emergency lights flickered on, revealing an empty doorway where nobody had been standing moments earlier. Jimin instinctively reached for Jungkook's hand. Jungkook gripped it tightly. Somewhere in the darkness a phone began ringing. Once, twice, 3 times. Then a voice came through the abandoned studio speakers. You should have stopped acting a long time ago, Jungkook. Jimin's fingers tightened around Jungkook's hand. Jungkook stared into the darkness, his face turning pale, because he recognized the voice. And the person speaking was someone who was never supposed to know what happened between them. The voice disappeared, but its final words remained hanging in the darkness like smoke. Jungkook stood completely still, his fingers still locked around Jimin's hand. You should have stopped acting a long time ago, Jungkook. The sentence repeated inside his head until every other sound became distant. Crew members were whispering nervously. Someone was trying to restart the main power. Another person was calling security. The emergency lights painted everyone's faces in a strange red glow. Jimin looked at Jungkook. Who was that? Jungkook did not answer. Jungkook, I don't know. It was a lie. Jimin immediately knew it was a lie. Jungkook's thumb began rubbing repeatedly against the side of his index finger, the nervous habit he had developed years ago whenever he was frightened. You do know, Jimin said. Jungkook swallowed. Not here. Then where? Anywhere but here. Jimin followed him as Jungkook moved toward the dressing rooms. The hallway smelled of wet concrete, electrical dust, and the faint sweetness of artificial fog. Behind them the crew's voices grew louder. What happened? Was someone inside? Check the cameras. Jungkook kept walking. Jungkook, slow down. He didn't. Jungkook, Jimin finally grabbed his arm. Jungkook stopped so abruptly that Jimin nearly collided with him. Tell me. Jungkook stared at him. I told you not here. You also told me you were fine. I am fine. You're crying during scenes that aren't supposed to make you cry. You barely sleep. You disappear between takes. You keep checking your phone even when it hasn't rung. And now someone turns off the lights and speaks your name through the studio speakers. Jimin's voice softened. Don't tell me you're fine. Jungkook looked down. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he whispered, someone has been sending me messages. Jimin's expression hardened. What kind of messages? At first they were harmless. What did they say? Things about the script. Jimin frowned. The script? Jungkook nodded. They knew scenes before we filmed them. Jimin's face changed. How? I don't know. What else? Jungkook hesitated. They knew things that weren't in the script. The hallway suddenly felt colder. Like what? Jimin asked. Jungkook looked at him. Like the fact that I hate thunderstorms. Jimin remembered. Years ago during a storm, Jungkook had sat awake in the corner of a hotel room pretending he wasn't afraid. Jimin had found him there and quietly placed headphones over his ears. Jungkook had never told anyone else about that night. Who knows that? Jimin asked. You. Jungkook paused. And one other person. Jimin's eyes narrowed. Who? Jungkook looked toward the dark end of the hallway. Someone I trusted. Before Jimin could ask another question, footsteps echoed behind them. Both turned. A security guard appeared around the corner. Jungkook, Jimin, you need to come back to the main set. Why? Jimin asked. The director wants everyone together until we figure out what happened. Jungkook immediately shook his head. No, the guard frowned. Excuse me, we aren't going back. Jimin looked at him. Why? Jungkook lowered his voice. Because whoever did this wanted me to hear that message. And they want me somewhere. Where? Jungkook looked at the emergency exit sign glowing at the end of the corridor. Away from everyone. Jimin understood immediately. Then we're staying together. Jimin, no. Jimin stepped closer. You asked me not to leave earlier, remember? Jungkook looked at him. The memory of the scene returned with painful clarity. Jimin walking away, Jungkook crying. The terrible realization that his fear had been far deeper than the fictional character he was playing. I remember, Jungkook whispered. Then I'm not leaving. They returned to the main set together. The director was standing beside the monitors, visibly irritated. The security team says there was no unauthorized entry. Jungkook stared at the monitor. Impossible. They checked the doors, then checked the internal system. The director frowned. Why? Jungkook pointed toward the speakers. That message didn't come from outside. The director's expression changed. Technicians began checking the sound system. Jimin remained beside Jungkook. He could feel Jungkook's hand trembling. Without thinking, Jimin reached over and gently touched his wrist. Jungkook looked down at their hands. Jimin quickly withdrew. Sorry, don't be. Their eyes met again. Neither spoke. Then one of the technicians shouted, We found something. Everyone turned. Someone accessed the studio audio system remotely. Can you trace it? The director asked. I'm trying. The technician typed rapidly. A location appeared on the screen. Jungkook's face drained of color. No, Jimin looked at the screen. The location was an old rehearsal building across town, a place Jungkook had not visited in years. Why does that place matter? Jimin asked. Jungkook didn't answer. Jungkook, that's where I learned how to dance. Jimin waited, and that's where I met him. The room became silent. Who? Jimin asked. Jungkook stared at the location. My former manager. The director immediately ordered security to contact the police, but Jungkook shook his head. Don't. Why not? Because if he's behind this, he'll disappear. Jimin looked at him. Then what do you want to do? Jungkook stared at the dark windows. I want to know why he's doing this. Jimin shook his head. You're not going there alone. I wasn't planning to. Jimin's eyes softened. Good. Hours later, the city was covered in mist. Jungkook sat inside a parked car across from the abandoned rehearsal building. Jimin sat beside him. Neither had spoken for several minutes. Rain tapped softly against the windshield. Do you remember what you said earlier? Jimin asked. Which part, when you said you forgot I was coming back? Jungkook stared through the windshield. Yes, were you talking about the scene? Jungkook remained silent. Jimin waited. Finally, Jungkook whispered no. Jimin's heart tightened. Then what were you talking about? Jungkook looked at him. His eyes were tired, vulnerable. You. Jimin didn't move. Jimin, every time you walk away from me, even when it's for something completely normal, there's this stupid voice in my head telling me that one day you'll walk away and never come back. Jimin's lips parted slightly. Why? Jungkook looked down. Because everyone eventually leaves. I'm still here. I know. Then believe it. Jungkook smiled sadly. I'm trying. Jimin reached across the center console and placed his hand over Jungkook's. Try harder. Jungkook looked at their hands. For several seconds he didn't move. Then his fingers slowly closed around Jimin's. Neither noticed the small red light blinking inside the abandoned building across the road. Neither noticed the camera pointed directly at their car, and neither heard the phone vibrating inside Jungkook's coat. Jungkook finally pulled it out. There was one new message. No number, no name. Just a photograph. Jungkook opened it. His breath stopped. It was a picture of him and Jimin sitting inside the car taken only seconds earlier. Beneath the photograph were 7 words. Now you understand why Jimin must leave. Jungkook's hand went cold. Jimin saw the photograph. His expression disappeared. Then another message appeared. Come inside alone, Jungkook. Jimin looked at him. Jungkook looked back. Neither spoke. Then Jimin quietly unlocked his seat belt. We're going together. Jungkook shook his head. No, you said you were afraid of losing me. Jimin opened the car door. Then don't make the mistake of pushing me away yourself. And before Jungkook could stop him, Jimin stepped into the rain. Jimin, Jungkook threw open the car door and ran into the rain, but Jimin was already halfway across the empty street, his silhouette dissolving into the mist surrounding the abandoned rehearsal building. Jimin, wait, Jungkook shouted. Jimin turned around. I'm not leaving you behind. His voice was swallowed by thunder. Jungkook reached him seconds later, grabbed his shoulder and pulled him beneath the broken awning of the building. You shouldn't have gotten out of the car. And you shouldn't have planned to go inside alone. This isn't a game. I know. Jimin looked directly into his eyes. That's why I'm here. Rainwater streamed from Jungkook's hair onto his forehead. He stared at Jimin for several seconds, anger and fear fighting inside him. If something happens to you, then something happens to both of us. Don't say that. Why? Jimin's voice softened. Because you already know how much that scares you. Jungkook looked away. The old building stood behind them like a forgotten memory. Its windows were dark, its walls were covered in peeling paint. Somewhere inside, a loose metal sign swung slowly in the wind, producing a hollow scraping sound. Jungkook remembered the place immediately. The smell of old wooden floors, the mirrors, the endless nights of practice. The first time he had believed he might actually become someone worth watching, and the man who had stood beside him during those years. We should leave, Jungkook whispered. Not until we know who sent that message. Jimin looked at the door. Then let's find out. The front door opened with a long metallic groan. Inside, the air smelled of dust, damp wood and something faintly chemical. Their footsteps echoed through the corridor. Jungkook turned on his flashlight. The beam moved across old posters, cracked mirrors, abandoned speakers, and photographs from years ago. Jimin stopped when he saw one photograph hanging crookedly on the wall. It showed a much younger Jungkook standing in the center of a dance group, smiling at the camera. Beside him stood a man with one hand resting proudly on Jungkook's shoulder. Jimin stared at the photograph. That's him. Jungkook nodded. His name was Daniel. What happened? Jungkook's jaw tightened. He left suddenly. Why? He was fired. Jimin looked at him. For what? Jungkook's flashlight lowered. For manipulating people. Jimin's expression changed. What does that mean? He used to tell me I wasn't good enough unless I followed everything he said. He controlled what I ate, when I slept, who I talked to. Jungkook paused. He convinced me that if I ever disagreed with him, I'd lose everything. Jimin's chest tightened. You were young, I know, you shouldn't have had to deal with that alone. Jungkook gave a bitter smile. I thought I deserved it. Jungkook, Jimin's voice was firm. You didn't. Jungkook looked at him, something inside his expression softened. That's why you scare me sometimes. Jimin frowned. Me, you remind me that I don't have to accept everything. Jimin stepped closer. Then let me remind you now. He gently touched Jungkook's shoulder. You're not that scared kid anymore. Before Jungkook could respond, a sound echoed from upstairs, a single footstep. Both looked toward the staircase. Someone's here, Jimin whispered. Jungkook nodded. They moved carefully upward. The wooden stairs creaked beneath their weight. Halfway up, the lights flickered on. Jimin grabbed Jungkook's sleeve. Did you do that? No, the lights flickered again. Then a projector suddenly activated at the end of the corridor. A white screen descended from the ceiling. Static filled the room. Jungkook stopped breathing. The screen displayed an old video. It showed Jungkook practicing alone in the same building years earlier. He looked exhausted, frustrated, young. The video continued. Daniel entered the frame. Again, Daniel said. Young Jungkook continued dancing. He stumbled. Again. He tried again. He fell. Again. Present-day Jungkook clenched his fists. Jimin watched silently. The video changed. Daniel was now standing directly in front of the younger Jungkook. If you want to succeed, you can't let anyone distract you. Young Jungkook nodded. Friends are distractions. The screen froze, then another sentence appeared. You forgot that lesson. Jimin turned toward Jungkook. This is psychological. Jungkook shook his head. He wants me afraid. Then don't give him what he wants. The projector suddenly switched to another recording. This time it showed Jungkook and Jimin from the studio earlier that evening. Jimin's eyes widened. The video showed Jungkook crying after the scene. It showed everything, their conversation. The moment Jungkook admitted he was afraid Jimin would leave, Jimin slowly turned toward Jungkook. How did he get this? Jungkook stared at the screen. Cameras. But there weren't any cameras in that room. There are now. The projector went black. A voice came from behind them. You're finally learning. Jimin spun around. A figure stood at the end of the corridor, tall, motionless, wearing a dark coat. Jungkook immediately recognized him. Daniel, the man smiled. Hello, Jungkook. Jimin stepped in front of Jungkook. Stay behind me. Daniel laughed softly. Still protecting him, Jimin didn't answer. You always were his weakness, Daniel continued. Jungkook's face hardened. Don't talk about him. Why? Because you finally admitted what he means to you. Jimin looked at Jungkook. Daniel smiled. Interesting. Jungkook stepped forward. What do you want? I want you to remember. Remember what? Daniel's expression became cold. Why I was fired. Jungkook's breathing slowed. You know why? Do I? Daniel pulled a small envelope from his coat. Perhaps you should ask Jimin. Jimin frowned. Why me? Daniel tossed the envelope onto the floor. It slid across the wooden boards and stopped at Jimin's feet. Jimin picked it up. Inside was a photograph. His face went pale. What is this? Jungkook asked. Jimin didn't answer. Jungkook took the photograph from his hand. It showed Jimin standing outside the rehearsal building years earlier. On the back was a date Jungkook recognized immediately. Jimin, Jungkook whispered. Why were you here? Jimin stared at him. His voice failed. Daniel smiled. Now we're getting somewhere. Jungkook looked between them. Jimin, what happened that day? Jimin's eyes filled with tears. I came here because I was looking for you. Jungkook froze. But you never told me. Because I never found you. Daniel laughed. That's not exactly true. Jimin looked at him. What are you talking about? Daniel's smile disappeared. Jimin found you, he just never knew it. The room fell silent. Jungkook's heartbeat thundered in his ears. Explain. Daniel reached into his coat again. 7 years ago, Jimin came here because he had something to give you. He held up a small black box. Jungkook stared at it. What's inside? Daniel looked directly at Jimin. The reason you two were never supposed to become this close. Jimin's face drained of color. No. Yes. Daniel opened the box. Inside was a folded letter, yellowed with age. Jungkook stared at it. What is that? Jimin whispered. A letter I wrote to you. Jungkook's eyes widened. You wrote me a letter? Jimin nodded slowly. 7 years ago. Jungkook reached for it, but Daniel closed the box. Not yet. Jungkook stepped forward. Give it to me. First, Daniel said, you need to know why Jimin never gave it to you. The old building became silent again. Jimin lowered his eyes. Jungkook looked at him, and for the first time that night, the fear in Jimin's face frightened him more than anything Daniel could have done. Jimin, Jungkook whispered, what did you write? Jimin, Jungkook whispered, what did you write? Jimin closed his eyes as though the question had been waiting for 7 years to reach him. The old rehearsal room seemed to hold its breath. Rain struck the broken windows. Somewhere in the ceiling, water dripped steadily onto the wooden floor. Daniel stood several meters away with the black box in his hand, watching them with the calm expression of someone who believed he already knew how the story would end. Jimin finally opened his eyes. I wrote that I was afraid. Jungkook stared at him. Afraid of me? No, Jimin shook his head. Afraid of what would happen if you knew the truth. What truth? Jimin's fingers trembled. That I cared about you long before either of us understood what that meant. Jungkook stopped breathing for a moment. Daniel watched silently. Jimin continued, his voice low and unsteady. 7 years ago you were practicing here almost every night. You always stayed after everyone else left. You thought nobody noticed. A faint smile appeared through his sadness. You had this habit of counting your steps under your breath. 1, 2, 3, 4. Whenever you made a mistake, you would start over instead of fixing the mistake from the middle. Jungkook looked away because he remembered. I used to watch you from the hall, Jimin said. Not because I wanted to spy on you, I just wanted to make sure you were okay. Why didn't you tell me? Because Daniel found out. Jungkook's expression hardened. What did he do? Jimin looked at Daniel. He told me to stay away from you. Daniel finally spoke. I warned you. You threatened me, Jimin replied. There's a difference. You were becoming a distraction. Jungkook stepped forward. You don't get to decide who matters to me. Daniel smiled faintly. That's what I was trying to teach you. People become weaknesses when you care too much. Jungkook's fists tightened. And you believed that? I was young, Jungkook answered bitterly. I believed whatever you told me. Jimin looked at him, but not forever. Jungkook turned toward Jimin. What happened after you wrote the letter? I came here, Jimin swallowed. I wanted to give it to you personally. I waited outside for almost 2 hours. I never saw you. I know, Jimin looked down. Daniel came outside instead. Jungkook's eyes moved toward Daniel. What did he say? Jimin's voice became quieter. He told me Jungkook didn't want me around. Jungkook shook his head immediately. I never said that. I know that now. Jimin looked at him. But back then I believed him. Daniel's expression remained unreadable. You were young, you didn't understand the situation. I understood enough to know you lied. Jimin's voice suddenly strengthened. You told me Jungkook had chosen his career over everyone else. You told me he would resent me if I became another burden. Jungkook looked at Daniel with disbelief. You made him think I hated him. I protected your future. No, Jungkook said quietly. You protected your control over me. Daniel's jaw tightened. Jimin stepped closer to Jungkook. I left the letter because I couldn't give it to you. And Daniel kept it. He said he'd destroy it. Jungkook looked at the box, but he didn't. No, Daniel replied. I kept it because I knew one day you'd need to understand. Jungkook reached for the box again. This time Daniel gave it to him without resistance. Jungkook opened it slowly. The letter was folded 4 times. Paper had yellowed along the edges. His hands trembled as he unfolded it. Jimin looked away. You don't have to read it. Jungkook stared at him. I need to. The first line was written in Jimin's handwriting. Jungkook recognized it immediately. Dear Jungkook, I don't know if I will ever have the courage to give you this. Jungkook's eyes moved slowly across the page. Jimin had written about small things, about the way Jungkook smiled when he was embarrassed, about the way he hummed while tying his shoes. About how he always gave the last piece of food to someone else even when he was hungry. About how Jimin wished Jungkook would stop believing that he had to earn the right to be cared for. Then Jungkook reached the final paragraph. I don't know what we will become, and maybe we will never become anything. But if one day you wonder whether someone was standing beside you when you thought you were alone, remember that I was there. I was always there. Jungkook's vision blurred. He lowered the letter. Jimin. Min wiped his eyes. I was too scared. You shouldn't have been. I know that now. Jungkook stepped closer. Why didn't you tell me later? Jimin laughed softly through his tears. Because by then everything had changed. You were becoming successful. Your life became bigger. Mine changed too, and every time I thought about telling you, I wondered whether I would ruin something beautiful. Jungkook looked at him. You thought honesty would ruin us. I thought losing you would. Jungkook's eyes filled again. Almost did. Jimin's face fell. I know. When you walked away during that scene tonight, Jungkook looked down at the letter. It brought everything back, that old fear, that feeling that someone was taking you away before I could say what I should have said years ago. Jimin reached for his hand. I'm here. Jungkook intertwined their fingers. I know. Daniel quietly turned toward the door. Jimin noticed. Where are you going? Daniel stopped. My part is finished. Jungkook looked up. Not yet. Daniel glanced back. You wanted answers, you have them. You filmed us. Yes, you manipulated the studio. Yes, you frightened me. Daniel's expression changed slightly. I wanted you to confront what you've spent years avoiding. Jungkook shook his head. You don't get to hurt people and call it a lesson. Daniel said nothing. You made Jimin believe I rejected him, Jungkook continued. You made me believe everyone who cared about me would eventually leave. You didn't protect me, you made me afraid of being loved. Daniel's face became harder. And yet you're standing here, because I finally understand that surviving something doesn't mean it was right. Jimin looked at Jungkook with quiet admiration. Daniel lowered his gaze. Perhaps I was wrong. Jungkook almost laughed. That's the first honest thing you've said tonight. Daniel placed his hands into his coat pockets. There is one more thing you should know. Jimin tensed. What? The studio wasn't the only place I recorded. Jungkook's expression changed. What do you mean? I recorded your conversations for months. Jimin's hand tightened around Jungkook's. Why? Because I wanted proof. Proof of what? Daniel looked at Jungkook. That you were no longer controlled by fear. Jungkook stared at him. You could have simply asked. You wouldn't have answered. Maybe I would have. Daniel shook his head. Not 7 years ago. He turned toward the door. But perhaps now. Jungkook watched him leave. He expected anger. Instead, he felt something stranger. Relief. The room suddenly seemed quieter. Jimin released a long breath. Is it over? Jungkook looked at him. I think so. Do you believe him? No. Jimin smiled faintly. Good. Jungkook looked down at the old letter again. I believe you. Jimin's eyes softened. That's enough. They walked outside together. The rain had stopped. The city smelled fresh, washed clean by the storm. Streetlights reflected in puddles across the pavement. Jungkook slipped the letter carefully into his coat. Jimin noticed. You're keeping it. Yes. Why? Because it waited 7 years for me. Jimin smiled. You always were sentimental. Only about important things. They reached the car. Jungkook opened the passenger door for Jimin. Before Jimin could get inside, Jungkook stopped him. Jimin, earlier you asked why I cried. Jimin nodded. I think I finally know. Why? Jungkook looked directly at him. Because I wasn't crying because the character was losing someone. His voice softened. I was crying because Jungkook was terrified that Jimin would leave. Jimin's eyes became glossy. Then don't make me leave. Jungkook smiled. I won't. Jimin stepped closer. Their foreheads touched gently. No cameras, no director, no script, no audience. Just two people standing beneath a quiet sky after years of misunderstanding. You know, Jimin whispered, we're supposed to be better actors than this. Jungkook laughed quietly. Maybe that's the problem. What? We got too good at pretending. Jimin smiled. Then maybe we should stop. Jungkook looked at him for a long moment. Maybe we should. They remained there, neither rushing to speak, because for the first time in years, silence didn't feel like fear, it felt like permission. And when they finally returned to the studio the next morning, the script was still waiting on the table, the cameras were still in place, and the scene where Jimin walked away was still scheduled to be filmed. But Jungkook no longer feared it. Because now, when the director called for Jimin to leave, Jungkook knew something the character in the script never could. Jimin could walk away from the scene and still come back to him. Places, everyone. The director's voice echoed across the studio the following morning, but Jungkook barely heard him. He stood beneath the same white spotlight where he had cried the night before, staring at the familiar mark taped onto the floor. The cameras were positioned exactly as before. The artificial rain machines waited above them. The warehouse doors remained open at the end of the set. Everything looked unchanged, yet nothing felt the same. Jimin stood several feet away, reading the final pages of the script. Every few seconds, Jimin glanced toward Jungkook. Jungkook caught him doing it and smiled. Jimin quickly looked down again. You two seem unusually calm today, the director remarked. Jimin lifted his eyebrows. Should we be nervous? You should be terrified, the director laughed. This is supposed to be the emotional climax. Jungkook looked at Jimin. We're ready, the director raised his hand. Action. Jimin turned away. The scene began exactly as written. Jimin walked slowly toward the warehouse doors while Jungkook remained behind him. The dialogue was simple, but the silence between the lines carried everything they had never been able to say. You can't follow me, Jimin said. Jungkook took one step forward. Why? Because sometimes loving someone means letting them go. Jungkook paused. The words struck him differently now. Jimin continued walking. If you come after me, you'll only make it harder. Jungkook looked at his back. He remembered the first night they had filmed this scene. He remembered the panic that had seized his chest when Jimin walked away. He remembered crying before he even understood why. But now Jungkook knew something his character had not known. Jimin was not disappearing. Jimin was only walking toward the next mark. Jungkook, Jimin said without turning around. Stay. Jungkook smiled faintly. I won't. Jimin stopped. The director watched closely. Why? Jimin asked. Jungkook delivered the scripted line, because if you leave I'll never know whether you're coming back. Jimin slowly turned around, their eyes met. For 1 second the studio vanished again, but this time Jungkook didn't feel afraid. Cut, the director lowered his headset. That was excellent, the crew applauded softly. Jimin walked toward Jungkook as the cameras stopped. You didn't cry, Jungkook smiled. I told you I'm learning. Jimin studied his face. Learning what? That leaving isn't always goodbye. Jimin's expression softened, and staying isn't always enough. Jungkook nodded. I know. They returned to their chairs while the crew prepared the next setup. Jimin sat beside Jungkook and quietly handed him a bottle of water. You haven't eaten. Jungkook looked at him. How do you know? Because you bite the inside of your cheek when you're hungry. Jungkook laughed. You notice too much. Someone has to. Jungkook opened the bottle. You know what I noticed? What? You still have the same handwriting. Jimin looked at him suspiciously. The letter? Jungkook nodded. I kept looking at it last night. You read it again, 3 times. Jimin covered his face. That's embarrassing. Why? Because I wrote some ridiculous things. Like what? Jimin peeked through his fingers. I'm not telling you. Jungkook smiled. You said I hummed while tying my shoes. Jimin's face turned red. You did. You were watching me that closely, apparently. Jungkook laughed softly. Jimin, what? Thank you. Jimin lowered his hands. For what? For being there. Jimin's expression became serious. I wish I had been braver. You were young. So were you. Jungkook looked toward the set. Maybe we both needed time. For what? To understand what we were afraid of. Jimin was quiet. And what are you afraid of now? Jungkook thought about the question. Losing what we have. Jimin nodded slowly. Me too, but you're not afraid enough to run anymore. No, Jimin smiled. I'm more afraid of running than staying. Jungkook looked at him. That's a good answer. I practiced. They laughed together. For a while everything felt ordinary. The crew moved around them. Someone adjusted the lighting. Someone else brought coffee. The director reviewed footage. It almost felt like the previous night had been a strange dream. Then Jungkook noticed something on the table, a small black envelope. His smile disappeared. Jimin saw it too. What's that? Jungkook reached for it. I don't know. The envelope had no name, no stamp, no handwriting, just one sentence printed across the front. For Jungkook and Jimin together. Jimin looked at Jungkook. Don't open it. Why? Because every time something mysterious appears, something terrible follows. Jungkook smiled faintly. You sound like the narrator of a thriller. I'm serious. Jungkook hesitated, then opened it carefully. Inside was a single photograph. It showed Jungkook and Jimin standing outside the rehearsal building the previous night. They were holding hands. The photograph had been taken from a distance. Jimin's face turned pale. Daniel, Jungkook shook his head. I don't know. There was something written on the back. Jungkook turned it over, 1 sentence. Some secrets should remain buried. Jimin stared at the words. Maybe we should tell the director. Jungkook nodded. We will, but before they could stand, the studio lights flickered. Once, twice. Then the monitor behind them switched on by itself. Everyone turned toward it. The screen showed a video file. The title was simply Jimin. Jimin froze. What is that? The video began. It showed Jimin walking through a hallway alone. The footage was old, grainy, and clearly recorded without his knowledge. Jimin watched himself stop outside a door. He looked younger, nervous. He held something in his hands. Jungkook stared at the screen. That's the night you came to the rehearsal building. Jimin nodded slowly. The video continued. A younger Jimin knocked on the door. No one answered. He waited. Then Daniel appeared behind him. Jimin in the present covered his mouth. Jungkook looked at him. You didn't tell me this part. Because I didn't remember. What happened? Jimin stared at the screen. Daniel spoke to his younger self. The audio was faint, but the words were clear enough. If you really care about Jungkook, you'll do what I'm asking. Younger Jimin looked frightened. What do you want? Daniel handed him a small envelope. Give this to him. Jimin stared at the envelope. What's inside? Something that will make him hate you. Present-day Jimin suddenly stood. Stop. The director looked at him. Should we cut the playback? Jimin shook his head. No, his voice trembled. Keep going. The video continued. Younger Jimin opened the envelope. His expression changed. Tears filled his eyes. Daniel said something else, but the audio became distorted. Then Jimin watched himself fold the paper and place it inside his pocket. The footage ended. The studio was silent. Jungkook looked at Jimin. What did Daniel give you? Jimin's face had gone completely pale. I don't know. You must know. I don't, Jimin. Jungkook, I swear. He pressed both hands against his temples. I remember the letter I wrote you. I remember Daniel talking to me, but I don't remember what was inside that envelope. Jungkook stood beside him. It's okay. No, Jimin shook his head. It's not. You don't know what it was. Exactly. Jimin looked at the screen. What if there was something else? Jungkook reached for his hand. We'll find out. Jimin stared at him. What if you don't like the answer? Jungkook squeezed his fingers. Then we'll face it together. The director slowly approached them. I think we need to stop filming. Jungkook nodded. Yes, and we should contact the authorities. Jimin looked down. Maybe. Jungkook noticed something else on the table. The black envelope was still open. Beneath the photograph was another piece of paper that neither of them had noticed before. Jungkook pulled it out. It was a copy of a document. At the top was an old date, 7 years earlier. Underneath was a signature, Jimin's signature. Jungkook read the first sentence. His expression changed completely. Jimin, what? Jungkook looked at him. This says you agreed to leave. Jimin stared at the paper. What? It says you signed a contract promising you would stay away from me. Jimin's eyes widened. I never signed anything like that. Jungkook turned the page. There was a second signature beneath Jimin's, Daniel's. Then why does your signature appear here? Jimin touched the paper with trembling fingers. I don't know. Jungkook studied the document. Something didn't feel right. The signature looked like Jimin's, but the ink was darker than the rest. The paper appeared newer than the date printed at the top. This was forged, Jungkook said. Jimin looked at him. How can you be sure? Because the date is 7 years old but the paper isn't. Jimin's eyes narrowed. Then someone created this recently. Jungkook nodded. And they want us to believe you signed it. Jimin looked toward the studio doors. Why? Jungkook's expression became serious. Because whoever is behind this doesn't want us together. Jimin stepped closer. Then they don't understand something. What? Jimin took Jungkook's hand. We're not pretending anymore. Jungkook looked down at their joined hands and smiled. No, he looked back at Jimin. We're not. For the first time since the mystery began, the fear between them seemed smaller than the trust they had built. The old lies were still there. The forged document remained unexplained. The missing memory from 7 years ago still waited for an answer. But Jungkook and Jimin no longer faced those questions separately. Whatever had been hidden from them, they would uncover it together. By late afternoon, the studio had emptied almost completely, leaving behind the faint smell of coffee, warm electrical equipment, and rain-soaked concrete. Jungkook sat alone at the edge of the stage, turning the forged document over in his hands while Jimin stood near the window, staring at the city beyond the glass. Neither had spoken for several minutes. The silence between them was no longer uncomfortable, but it carried the weight of everything they had discovered. Jimin, Jungkook finally said, come here. Jimin turned. What are you thinking? Jimin walked toward him slowly. Too many things, tell me one. Jimin sat beside him. I'm thinking about how easily I believed someone else 7 years ago. Jungkook looked down at the paper. You were trying to protect me. I thought I was. Jimin rubbed his palms together, a nervous habit he had whenever he was trying to organize thoughts he couldn't explain. But now I keep wondering whether there was something else I forgot. Jungkook watched him carefully. You said you couldn't remember everything about that night. I remember the hallway, I remember Daniel, I remember the letter. Jimin paused, but after that there are pieces missing. Because you were frightened. Maybe. Jimin looked toward the darkening windows. Sometimes fear doesn't erase a memory, it changes the way you remember it. Jungkook understood. He had spent years doing the same thing. Every painful moment had been rearranged inside his mind until it became easier to survive. Then let's not force the memories, Jungkook said. Let's find the truth another way. Jimin looked at him. How? The building. We already searched it. Not completely. Jimin frowned. What did we miss? Jungkook pulled out his phone and opened the photograph from the old rehearsal building. He zoomed in on the background. Look. Jimin leaned closer. That's the old storage room. Exactly. The door was locked, and Daniel knew something was inside. Jimin stared at the image. You think there are records there? I think whoever has been manipulating us wanted us to remember that place for a reason. They returned to the abandoned building just before sunset. The rain had stopped, but the pavement remained wet, reflecting the orange sky. Inside, the building felt different in daylight, less threatening, more tragic. Dust floated through the narrow beams of sunlight entering through broken windows. Jungkook walked beside Jimin, their shoulders occasionally brushing. When they reached the storage corridor, Jimin stopped. I remember this. Jungkook turned. What? There used to be a mirror here. He pointed toward an empty section of wall. A huge one. Jungkook examined the wall. There's a mark. Behind a stack of old wooden boards they found the remains of the mirror frame. Jungkook pulled the boards aside. A small metal panel was hidden behind them. Jimin crouched beside him. What's that? I don't know. Jungkook pressed the panel. It opened. Inside was a narrow compartment containing several old memory cards, a key and a small digital recorder. Jimin stared. Someone kept everything. Jungkook picked up the recorder. Let's see if it still works. He pressed the button. Static filled the corridor, then a young voice emerged. I don't know if I'm doing the right thing. Jimin froze. It was his voice. Jungkook looked at him. The recording continued. If Jungkook ever hears this, I hope he understands that I wasn't trying to abandon him. Jimin's eyes filled with tears. He covered his mouth. That's me. Jungkook placed one hand gently against his back. Keep listening. The younger Jimin continued speaking. Daniel told me Jungkook was in danger. Said there were people watching him. He told me that if I stayed close they would use me to hurt Jungkook. Jungkook's expression hardened. So that's what he told you? Yes, Jimin's younger voice trembled. I didn't know whether to believe him, but then he showed me photographs. The recording paused, there was a sound of paper moving. He showed me pictures of Jungkook leaving practice, he showed me people following him, I thought they were real. Jungkook closed his eyes. They probably were. Jimin looked at him. What? Maybe Daniel wasn't lying about everything. The recording continued. Daniel said the only way to protect Jungkook was to make him hate me. He said if Jungkook believed I had betrayed him, he would stop looking for me. Jimin's breathing became unsteady. I couldn't do it. His younger voice cracked. I couldn't make him hate me. Jungkook's eyes filled with tears. The recording continued. So I wrote him the truth instead. Jimin looked at Jungkook. That's the letter? Yes, but Daniel said there was another envelope. Jungkook nodded. The younger Jimin continued. Daniel gave me another envelope and told me it contained proof that someone was following Jungkook. I didn't open it. I couldn't trust him anymore. I hid it. The recording stopped. Silence returned. Jimin stared at the recorder. I hid it. Where? Jungkook asked. Jimin closed his eyes. I don't remember. They sat on the dusty floor for several minutes. Then Jimin suddenly opened his eyes. Wait, he stood. What? I remember something. Jimin walked toward the old mirror frame. That night I was scared. I didn't want Daniel to find the envelope. He touched the wall. I remember putting it somewhere behind the mirror. Jungkook looked at the hidden compartment. But it's not here. Jimin shook his head. No, there was another place. He moved along the wall until his fingers stopped at a loose wooden panel. Jungkook helped him remove it. Behind the panel was a narrow cavity. Inside sat a small envelope covered in dust. Jimin stared at it. That's it. Jungkook didn't touch it. Do you want to open it? Jimin nodded. His hands trembled as he broke the seal. Inside were several photographs and a handwritten note. The photographs showed Jungkook leaving practice, but the people following him were not strangers, they were security personnel. These weren't people trying to hurt you, Jimin whispered. They were protecting you. Jungkook examined the photographs. Then why did Daniel make them look dangerous? Jimin unfolded the note. It was written by Daniel, because fear was easier to control than trust. Jungkook's jaw tightened. He manipulated you. Jimin nodded. And he manipulated me. The final photograph was different. It showed Daniel meeting another man outside the building. Jungkook recognized him immediately. That's the producer from our current project. Jimin looked at him. What? He's the one who recommended Daniel for the security consultation. Jimin's eyes widened. You think they're connected? I don't know. Jungkook looked at the photograph again, but it explains how someone knew about our filming schedule. They returned to the city and immediately contacted the authorities. The evidence was copied, the photographs were secured, and the digital recordings were transferred for investigation. Daniel's actions were no longer merely mysterious, they were part of a deliberate pattern of manipulation stretching across years. But the most important discovery was not the evidence. It was what the truth did to Jimin and Jungkook. For the first time, the memory that had separated them began to lose its power. That night, Jungkook and Jimin sat on the balcony of their hotel, listening to the city breathe below them. Cars moved like streams of light. Somewhere in the distance, music drifted through the warm night air. Jimin held the old letter in his hands. I used to think this letter was proof that I had failed you. Jungkook looked at him. It isn't. What is it? Proof that you tried. Jimin smiled faintly. You really believe that? I do. Jimin looked down. Then I want you to know something. What? When you cried during that scene, I wasn't scared because you were crying. Jungkook waited. I was scared because I realized how much pain you had been carrying without telling me. Jungkook looked toward the city. I didn't know how to explain it. You don't have to explain everything at once. Jimin moved closer. But don't disappear inside yourself anymore. Jungkook smiled. I'll try. No, Jimin shook his head. Promise. Jungkook turned toward him. I promise. Jimin gently rested his head against Jungkook's shoulder. They stayed that way for a long time. There were no cameras. No scripts, no director telling them what expression to make or what words to say. Jungkook reached for Jimin's hand and intertwined their fingers. You know what I learned? Jungkook asked. What? The scene where you leave doesn't hurt anymore. Jimin lifted his head. Why? Because now I understand the difference between goodbye and see you later. Jimin smiled. And which one was our story? Jungkook looked at him. Definitely see you later. Jimin laughed softly. The sound was warm and genuine. Jungkook smiled too. The past had not disappeared. The fear had not magically vanished. There were still unanswered questions about the producer, Daniel's remaining connections, and the people who had helped create the deception, but something fundamental had changed. Jungkook no longer believed love was measured by how desperately he could prevent someone from leaving. Jimin no longer believed caring for Jungkook meant silently sacrificing his own voice. They had spent years acting as though distance was safer than honesty. Now they were learning that the opposite could also be true. Sometimes the bravest thing two people could do was simply stay, speak, and let themselves be seen. And when morning arrived, Jungkook woke to find Jimin still sitting beside him, the old letter resting safely on the table between them. Jungkook looked at Jimin and smiled. For once, he wasn't afraid of what the next scene would bring. The final day of filming arrived beneath a sky so clear that neither Jungkook nor Jimin could believe the storm from a few days earlier had ever existed. Sunlight poured through the studio windows, touching the polished floor with warm gold. The cameras were already prepared when Jungkook walked onto the set, but instead of looking toward the equipment, he looked for Jimin. Jimin was standing near the wardrobe area, adjusting the sleeve of his costume while quietly humming under his breath. Jungkook smiled. That little habit had always made him feel strangely calm. "You're staring again," Jimin said without looking up. Jungkook laughed. "How did you know?" "Because you always get quiet when you stare." Jimin finally turned. "And because I've known you long enough." Jungkook walked toward him. "Are you nervous?" "A little." "Why?" "Because this is the last scene." Jungkook glanced toward the cameras. "It's only a scene," Jimin smiled. "That's what you said before you cried." Jungkook covered his face with one hand. "You're never going to let that go, are you?" "Never," Jimin laughed. The sound immediately softened the tension in Jungkook's chest. Around them the crew moved quietly. The director approached with the final pages of the script. "This is it." He looked at Jungkook and Jimin. The last scene is simple. Jimin leaves, Jungkook watches him go, then Jungkook smiles because he knows he'll see him again. Jungkook looked at Jimin. "Sounds familiar." Jimin smiled. "Very." The director studied them for a moment. "One more thing, I don't want you to force the emotion, you've already lived it." Jungkook nodded. "Understood." The crew took their positions, the lights dimmed, the studio became silent. Action. Jimin stood beside the warehouse doors, exactly where he had stood during the first scene. He looked at Jungkook. "Are you sure?" Jungkook nodded. "I'm sure." Jimin took one step backward. "You know I have to go." "I know." "Another step, and you won't follow me." Jungkook smiled. "No." Jimin's expression softened. "Why?" Jungkook looked directly at him. "Because I trust you." Jimin's eyes became glossy. The line wasn't in the script. The director remained silent. Jimin continued. "And if I don't come back?" Jungkook's smile faded for a second, but he didn't look away. "Then I'll wait until you do." Jimin took another step. "How long?" Jungkook's voice became softer. "As long as it takes." Jimin looked down, his shoulders trembled slightly, then he smiled. "That's not acting." Jungkook smiled back. "No." Jimin turned and walked toward the doors. This time Jungkook didn't chase him, he didn't panic, he didn't cry, he simply watched. Jimin opened the door. Sunlight flooded the set, he stepped outside. Then after a few seconds Jimin turned around and looked back at Jungkook. Their eyes met. Jimin smiled, Jungkook smiled too. "Cut," the director whispered. Nobody moved. The studio remained silent for several seconds before the director finally lowered his headset. "That's the ending." Applause slowly filled the room. Jimin walked back toward Jungkook. When he reached him, Jungkook whispered, "You came back." Jimin smiled. "I said I would." Jungkook looked at him. "You did." The director approached them, visibly emotional. "I don't think we could have filmed that any better." Jimin laughed. "We didn't even follow the script." "Sometimes," the director said, "the best performances happen when people stop pretending." Jungkook looked at Jimin. The words stayed with him. After the crew finished packing, the studio became almost empty. The same place that had once felt frightening now felt strangely peaceful. Jungkook stood alone beneath the spotlight one final time. Jimin approached from behind. "What are you doing?" "Remembering bad memories." Jungkook shook his head. "Not anymore." Jimin stood beside him. "What do you remember?" Jungkook looked around the room. "The rain, the first time you walked away, the night I cried." He smiled. "The letter." Jimin nodded. "And now I remember you coming back." Jimin quietly took the old letter from his pocket. "I thought you might want this." Jungkook accepted it. "You kept it for 7 years. Why?" Jimin looked at him. "Because some words deserve to survive even when people aren't ready to hear them." Jungkook carefully folded the letter and placed it against his chest. "Then I'll keep it for the next 7. Jimin smiled. "Only 7, maybe 70. Jimin laughed. "That's better." Outside, evening had begun to settle over the city. The air smelled of rain even though the sky was clear. Jungkook and Jimin walked out of the studio together. Neither rushed, neither needed to. Their footsteps moved at the same rhythm across the pavement. "Jimin," Jungkook said. Do you regret it?" Jimin looked at him. "Regret what?" "The letter, everything that happened." Jimin thought for a moment. "I regret being afraid." Jungkook nodded. "Me too, but I don't regret meeting you." Jungkook smiled. "Neither do I." They reached the car. Jimin stopped before opening the door. "You know what I realized?" "What?" "When I first watched you cry during that scene, I thought you were afraid of losing me." Jungkook waited, but now I think you were actually afraid of losing the version of yourself that existed when you believed everyone would leave. Jungkook stared at him. He laughed softly. That's annoyingly accurate. Jimin smiled. I've had 7 years to think about it. Jungkook looked toward the fading sunlight. Maybe that's what acting taught us. What? Sometimes we hide behind characters because it's easier to say difficult things when we pretend they belong to someone else. Jimin nodded. And sometimes the character accidentally tells the truth. Jungkook looked at him. Like when I said I couldn't let you go. Jimin's smile became gentle. You finally understand why that line mattered. Yes, Jungkook took a slow breath. I wasn't supposed to stop you from leaving. Jimin waited. I was supposed to trust that you would choose to come back. Jimin's eyes softened, and I did. They stood quietly beneath the evening sky. No cameras followed them. No one shouted instructions. No script waited for them. For the first time there was no need to perform. Jungkook reached for Jimin's hand. Jimin accepted it without hesitation. Ready? Jimin asked. For what? Whatever comes next. Jungkook smiled. With you? Yes, then I'm ready. They walked toward the car together. Behind them, the studio lights slowly switched off one by one until the warehouse disappeared into darkness. The place that had witnessed Jungkook's fear, Jimin's secret, their misunderstandings, and the tears that neither had expected had finally become only a memory. The story they had filmed was over. The scene where Jimin walked away was finished. The cameras had stopped rolling. But Jungkook no longer believed that every ending meant loss. Sometimes an ending was simply a doorway. Sometimes a goodbye was only temporary. And sometimes, after years of fear, two people finally realized that they had never truly been separated by distance, silence, or time. They had simply been waiting for the courage to stop acting. Jungkook looked at Jimin as they drove into the quiet night. Jimin, yes, thank you for coming back. Jimin smiled and rested his head against the seat. Thank you for finally letting me. Jungkook laughed softly. Outside the window, the city lights passed like stars. Inside the car there was only warmth, silence, and the quiet certainty that whatever happened next, neither Jungkook nor Jimin needed a script anymore. The acting was over, and for the first time their lives could begin without one. 3 months later, Jungkook stood alone in the same studio where everything had begun. The building was quieter now. The old warehouse had been renovated, the broken windows replaced, and the dark corridors filled with warm lights. Yet Jungkook could still remember the night when the speakers had suddenly come alive and a mysterious voice had spoken his name. He could still remember the rain, Jimin walking away, and the tears he had been unable to hide. But the memory no longer frightened him. It simply reminded him of how far he had come. Jungkook walked toward the center of the empty stage and looked at the floor. The same white mark remained beneath his feet. He smiled. Still remembering, Jimin's voice came from behind him. Jungkook turned. Jimin stood in the doorway holding 2 cups of coffee. You always know where to find me, because you always come back here when you're thinking too much. Jimin walked closer and handed him a cup. You haven't changed. Jungkook accepted it. Neither have you. I have, Jimin smiled. I learned to stop running. Jungkook looked at him. Me too. They stood together beneath the quiet studio lights. For a while neither spoke. Then Jimin pulled something from his coat pocket. It was the old letter. Jungkook stared at it. You still carry that, sometimes. Jimin handed it to him. I thought you should have the original. Jungkook slowly unfolded the paper. The handwriting was still there, slightly faded with time. Dear Jungkook, I don't know if I will ever have the courage to give you this. Jungkook smiled as he read the words again. You know, he said quietly, I used to think this letter was about what you felt 7 years ago. Jimin looked at him. And now I think it's about what we were both too afraid to say. Jimin's expression softened. What would you write if you had to write me a letter today? Jungkook thought for a moment. I'd probably say thank you. Only thank you. No. Jungkook smiled. I'd say that I'm no longer afraid when you walk away. Jimin's eyes became glossy. Why? Because I've learned something. What? Jungkook folded the letter carefully. People who truly care about you don't always stay in the same place. Sometimes they leave for a while, sometimes life pulls them in different directions, but that doesn't automatically mean they are gone. Jimin nodded slowly. That's beautiful. I learned it from you. Jimin laughed softly. You make everything sound more dramatic than it needs to be. You wrote me a 7-year-old love letter. Jimin's face turned red. Don't call it that. What should I call it? A very emotional friendship letter. Jungkook laughed. That's not convincing. Jimin shook his head, smiling. You haven't changed, neither have you. I just said I changed. Not the important parts. Jimin looked at him. What are the important parts? Jungkook stepped closer. The way you notice when I'm nervous. The way you tap your fingers against your cup when you're thinking. The way you pretend you're not worried when you are. The way you always look back before you leave. Jimin's eyes softened. You noticed all that. I noticed everything. The silence between them became warm. Jimin looked down at the letter. Do you remember the first time you cried, during the scene? Yes, Jungkook smiled. I remember, you were embarrassed. Very, you kept saying you had ruined everything. I thought I had. Jimin shook his head. You didn't ruin anything. Jungkook looked around the studio. You know what I think now? What, maybe that scene needed to happen? Jimin tilted his head. Why? Because if it hadn't I might have kept pretending. Jimin nodded. And I might have kept hiding. Jungkook looked at him. So maybe the scene wasn't the beginning. What was it? The ending of the part where we were afraid? Jimin smiled. And the beginning of what came after. Outside the studio, rain began to fall softly. Jimin looked toward the windows. It's raining. Jungkook smiled. It always rains when something important happens. That's your imagination. Maybe. Jimin moved toward the door. Jungkook followed. Before they left, Jimin looked back at the empty stage. Do you ever miss it? The acting? Yes, Jungkook thought about it. Sometimes. Jimin smiled. Me too. But I don't miss pretending. Jimin nodded. They walked into the rain together. Neither carried an umbrella. The water soaked their clothes within seconds, but neither cared. Jungkook laughed as Jimin tried to shield the old letter beneath his jacket. Careful, Jungkook said. It's important. I know. Jimin held the letter closer. That's why I'm protecting it. Jungkook watched him for a moment, then he smiled. Jimin, what? Come here. Jimin stepped closer. Jungkook gently placed his hand over Jimin's. Whatever happens next. Jimin looked into his eyes. I know. You don't even know what I was going to say. Jimin smiled. I know you. Jungkook laughed. Fine, then you say it. Jimin looked at him for a long moment. Whatever happens next, we don't hide. Jungkook nodded. Agreed. We don't let fear make decisions for us. Agreed. And if one of us has to leave, Jimin paused. Jungkook's expression softened. The other trusts that they'll come back. Jimin smiled. Exactly. Jungkook squeezed his hand. Then we're ready. They continued walking through the rain as the city lights reflected around them. Behind them, the studio disappeared into the distance. The cameras were gone. The scripts were finished. The characters they had once played no longer mattered. What mattered was the truth they had discovered beneath all the acting. Jungkook had cried when Jimin left because, somewhere deep inside, he had believed that every departure was permanent. Jimin had stayed silent because he had believed that love could be dangerous if spoken aloud. 7 years of fear had convinced them that pretending was safer than honesty, but the truth had finally broken through. Jimin had not disappeared. Jungkook had not been abandoned. The letter had not been destroyed. And the words they had been afraid to say had survived every misunderstanding between them. As the rain continued falling, Jimin glanced at Jungkook and smiled. Jungkook smiled back. No director called cut. No camera captured the moment. No script told them what to say next. And that was exactly what made it real. The rain had almost stopped when Jungkook and Jimin reached the quiet street beyond the studio. The city shimmered beneath the remaining drops, and the night air carried the clean scent of wet pavement. Jimin held the old letter carefully against his chest, while Jungkook walked beside him with a peaceful smile. For years, Jungkook had believed that losing someone began the moment they walked away. Now he understood something different. Sometimes walking away was not abandonment. Sometimes it was simply a step toward coming back. Jimin stopped beneath a streetlight and looked at Jungkook. Do you still remember that scene? Jungkook smiled. The one where you left. Yes. I remember everything. The rains. The lights. The cameras. The tears, Jungkook said, laughing softly. Jimin smiled. You were really crying. I know. You couldn't even finish the line. Jungkook looked at him, because it wasn't the character speaking anymore. Jimin's smile slowly faded into something softer. It was you, Jimin whispered. Jungkook nodded. It was me. For a moment, neither said anything. Then Jimin opened the old letter one final time. I spent 7 years thinking these words came too late. Jungkook looked at the faded handwriting. They didn't. Jimin folded the letter. How do you know? Because if you had given it to me 7 years ago, maybe we wouldn't have understood it. Jimin looked at him. And now? Jungkook smiled. Now I do. Jimin stepped closer. What does it say to you now? Jungkook took a slow breath. It says that even when I thought I was alone, someone was there. Jimin's eyes glistened. And that someone was me. Yes. Jimin smiled through the tears gathering in his eyes. I'm glad you finally know. Jungkook gently touched his shoulder. And I'm glad you came back. Jimin nodded. I told you I would. They began walking again, side by side. Behind them, the studio lights finally disappeared completely. The stage was empty. The cameras were silent. The script had ended. But Jungkook no longer needed a script to know what came next. He knew Jimin would have difficult days. He knew there would be moments when fear returned. He knew the past could never be erased completely. But he also knew that love was not about guaranteeing that nobody would ever leave. It was about trusting that someone who truly mattered could walk away without becoming a stranger. Jungkook looked at Jimin one last time. Jimin. Yes. Next time we act. Jimin smiled. What? Let's choose a happier ending. Jimin laughed. No. Jungkook raised an eyebrow. No. Jimin shook his head. Let's stop acting altogether. Jungkook smiled. Deal. And beneath the fading rain, Jungkook and Jimin disappeared into the warm lights of the city together. The scene was over. The tears were real. The goodbye had been temporary. And this time, neither of them was afraid of what came after. The end.